She stood in front of 200 guests, champagne in hand, and laughed at him. "Fix it," Scarlett Whitmore said, gesturing toward the legendary Porsche like it was a broken toaster. "Fix my father's car, and I'll marry you." The room erupted. A grease-stained mechanic at a billionaire's estate. The joke wrote itself. But Mason Brooks didn't flinch. He just crouched down, looked into that engine, and felt his blood run cold. Because he recognized the handwriting of a dead man inside that machine. And what he found next would destroy everything Scarlett thought she knew about her father's death. If you're watching this for the first time, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories on this channel don't pull punches. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And stay until the very end, because what happens in that engine bay will leave you speechless. The garage smelled like it always did. Motor oil, old rubber, and something faintly metallic that never fully washed out, no matter how many times Mason scrubbed the concrete floor. He'd tried once, years ago, with industrial cleaner and a wire brush, scrubbing on his hands and knees while Liam sat in the corner eating a peanut butter sandwich and watching him like he was the most interesting thing in the world. "You're not going to get it out, Dad," the boy had said, 7 years old and already certain about things. "I know," Mason had said. He kept scrubbing anyway. That was who Mason Brooks was. The kind of man who kept scrubbing even when he knew it wouldn't work. He was 32 now, which felt both older and younger than it should have. Older because of everything that had happened. Younger because he still didn't fully understand how life had arranged itself around him into this particular shape. A dead wife, a 9-year-old son, a garage in Mill Haven, Tennessee, that made just enough money to cover the bills if he was careful, and almost enough money if he wasn't. He was careful most months. Most. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday, printed on paper that probably cost more per sheet than Mason's grocery budget for the week. Heavy cream stock, engraved text, the kind of thing that felt wrong in hands that were perpetually stained at the knuckles no matter what. He'd read it 3 times standing over the sink, then set it on the counter and made Liam's dinner. Macaroni and cheese from the box, peas mixed in because that was the deal they'd made, and read it a 4th time after Liam went to bed. "Mr. Brooks, you come highly recommended by the estate of Gerald Whitmore. We are seeking a qualified specialist to assess a vintage Porsche 911 that has been in storage for approximately 9 years. Compensation will be provided for your time regardless of outcome. Please attend the Whitmore estate on Saturday evening at 7 o'clock. No signature. Just an address on the east side of the county where the houses had gates and the gates had intercom systems, and the lawns looked like someone measured every blade of grass." Mason wasn't sure what highly recommended by the estate of Gerald Whitmore meant. Gerald Whitmore had been dead for 9 years. Mason had never met the man. The only connection he could think of was his mentor, old Carl Rigby, who'd spent 40 years building and restoring cars the way other men wrote poetry, slow and obsessive and completely certain that what he was making mattered. Carl had worked on a lot of cars for a lot of wealthy people. Mason had apprenticed under him through his early 20s, before Carl's hands got too bad and the shop closed down. Before Carl died. Mason set the invitation under a coffee mug so it wouldn't blow away and told himself he'd think about it. He went on Saturday. What? The estate was exactly what he'd expected, and somehow worse in person. The driveway alone was longer than Mason's entire street. There were valets, actual valets, young men in black vests, who looked at Mason's 12-year-old pickup with the kind of professional neutrality that somehow felt worse than open contempt. One of them took the keys without comment. Another pointed him toward the main entrance. Mason had dressed as well as he could manage. Dark jeans with no visible stains. A collared shirt he'd bought 2 years ago for a parent-teacher conference and worn maybe 3 times since. Clean boots. He'd scrubbed his hands twice with the industrial soap and gotten most of it. Most. The party, and it was clearly a party, not just a gathering, spilled out from the main house onto a lit terrace that overlooked manicured grounds. There were easily 200 people, women in dresses that probably cost more than Mason's truck, men in suits that fit like they'd been poured into them, servers drifting through the crowd with trays of things Mason couldn't identify. He stood at the edge of it all and felt exactly like what he was, the wrong kind of person in the wrong kind of place. "You must be the mechanic." He turned. The woman who'd spoken was maybe 30, and she carried herself the way some people carry weapons, like it was natural, like it had been part of her for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Dark hair pulled back, a dress the color of deep water, champagne flute held loosely at her side. She was looking at him the way he might look at an engine he wasn't sure was worth the trouble. "Mason Brooks?" he said. "I got an invitation. I know who you are." She didn't offer her hand. "I'm Scarlett Whitmore. This is my home." He recognized the name. Everyone in the county would. Gerald Whitmore's daughter, who'd taken her father's company and turned it into something 3 times its original size before she was 28. The business magazines loved her. He'd seen her face on a cover once at the dentist's office and thought she looked like someone who'd never had a bad day, which wasn't fair but was the impression. Up close, she looked more tired than the magazine had suggested, but she hid it well. "Thank you for coming," she said, in a tone that suggested she hadn't entirely wanted him to. "The car is in the garage. I'll have someone take you." He'd expected a storage situation. Dusty covers, dead battery, the kind of neglect that accumulates when something gets locked away and forgotten. What he found was a Porsche 911 that had been sealed in a temperature-controlled garage like a museum exhibit, covered in a cloth that hadn't a speck of dust on it, sitting on proper tire support so the rubber wouldn't flat spot. Someone had maintained the storage conditions meticulously, even while apparently never touching the car itself. Mason pulled the cover back slowly. He stood there for a moment with it bundled in his hands. The color was a very specific shade of dark silver that he recognized, because he'd watched Carl Rigby mix that paint himself, back when Mason was 23 and still learning what patience looked like. A custom batch, Carl had called it, lunar mist. Said he'd mixed it for a private commission, someone who wanted the car to look like it existed between colors rather than having one. Mason set the cover down. He walked around the car once, slowly, the way Carl had taught him. You walked the whole car before you touched anything. You looked at everything before you made judgments. The exterior was flawless, preserved like it hadn't moved in 9 years, which was apparently true. He crouched at the driver's door and looked through the glass. Interior clean, gauges intact, nothing obviously wrong. He went to the hood, rear engine, like all the classic 911s, hood in the front for storage, and popped it open to find the spare tire compartment and the front trunk space, both empty and clean. Then he went to the engine. The moment he lifted the rear lid, he knew something was wrong, not with the car's appearance. Everything looked intact. The flat-six engine sat where it should. The covers were in place. Nothing was visibly damaged or missing. But there was a smell, very faint, something that didn't belong. Mason leaned in closer. He'd been around enough engines to know their particular signatures, the way oil settles over time, the way rubber ages, the way metal oxidizes in storage. What he was smelling didn't fit any of that. It was something else, something that had been added. His hands moved before he'd fully decided to move them. He started with the covers, the ones he should check first anyway, the most accessible components. Everything looked fine. He went deeper. It was in the fuel injection system that he found the first thing. It was subtle, the kind of subtle that would fool most mechanics, even good ones. A specific component had been modified in a way that looked factory at a glance, but wasn't. Someone had done this carefully. Someone who understood the system well enough to make damage look like age. Someone who knew what they were doing. Mason sat back on his heels and stared at it. This car hadn't broken down. This car had been broken. He'd been in the garage for 20 minutes when the doors opened and Scarlett Whitmore came in, and she brought half the party with her. Not all of them. Maybe 30 people, the inner circle, the ones who'd followed her in the way wealthy people follow certain other wealthy people, because being near them felt like proximity to something. "Ladies and gentlemen," Scarlett said, and her voice had shifted into something more performative, a register. Mason recognized as the voice people used when they had an audience they wanted to entertain. "Our specialist has arrived to assess the infamous Porsche. Apparently he comes highly recommended." She paused to let the mild skepticism land. A few people smiled. "Let's see what he's found." 30 pairs of eyes turned to Mason. He straightened up and looked at her. She was watching him with an expression that was almost friendly. The kind of almost friendly that was really just a nicer word for condescending. "Your engine's been sabotaged," he said. Silence. "I'm sorry," Scarlett said. Someone modified the fuel injection system. They knew what they were doing. It would have caused a gradual failure that looked like normal mechanical breakdown. Not obvious unless you knew what to look for. But it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't age. More silence. A different quality now. Scarlett's expression flickered. Something moved across it that she pulled back before it finished arriving. Then she smiled, and the smile was the kind that didn't involve her eyes at all. The car has been sitting for 9 years, Mr. Brooks. I think perhaps what you're seeing is simply, I know what age looks like, Mason said. He wasn't trying to be rude, he just didn't know how to dress it up differently. This isn't that. Someone in the crowd laughed, a short, dismissive sound. Someone else murmured something to the person next to them. Mason caught the words garage and clearly and stopped trying to listen. Scarlett set her champagne flute down on a nearby shelf with a small, precise click. She walked toward him slowly, heels on the concrete floor, and stopped about 4 feet away, looking at him with something that had sharpened past amusement into something else. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "this car was built by one of the most respected engineers in the country. It's been in controlled storage for 9 years. I brought you here to assess its condition and tell me whether it can be restored. I did not bring you here to invent drama." "I'm not inventing anything." He looked back at the engine. "I'm telling you what's there." "And if I told you," she said slowly, the way someone measures out words for maximum effect, "that if you could actually fix this supposed sabotage, actually get this car running, I would be so impressed that I'd marry you." It landed perfectly. The crowd erupted. Genuine laughter this time, delighted laughter, the kind that comes when someone powerful makes a good joke at someone else's expense. A few people actually clapped. One man in a gray suit was wiping his eyes. Mason looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the engine. He crouched down again, reached in carefully, and started working. The laughter faded after a few minutes, when it became clear he was simply going to keep going. The crowd drifted. A few people stayed, not because they believed him, he suspected, but because they weren't sure what to do with someone who didn't react the way he was supposed to. One woman in a red dress stayed the entire time, watching him work with an expression Mason couldn't quite read. Scarlett stayed too. She didn't say anything. She stood back against the far wall with her arms crossed and watched him work. Mason worked the way Carl had taught him, methodically, quietly, touching nothing he didn't need to touch, disturbing nothing without noting its position first. He talked to himself a little, under his breath, the way he always did when he was focused. Little notes. Okay. There it is. That's interesting. That shouldn't be there. It took 40 minutes before he found the second thing. He almost missed it. It was built into the engine block itself. Not a modification exactly, but a construction choice. A specific deliberate cavity in a place that had no engineering reason to exist. The kind of thing you'd only see if you knew to look for it. The kind of thing that could only have been put there by the person who built the engine. By Carl. Mason stared at it. The cavity was empty. Whatever had been inside it was gone. But the space was real, and it had been built with intention, and it had been built by a man who was dead, in a car commissioned by another man who was also dead, and both of those deaths had felt, until about 40 minutes ago, like simply the way things ended. Now Mason wasn't sure. He sat back on the concrete floor of the garage. He was aware of Scarlett watching him. I was aware that he probably looked insane, a grease-stained mechanic sitting on the floor of a billionaire's garage at 9 o'clock at night, staring into an engine like it had told him something. It had told him something. He wasn't sure yet what to do with it. "Well?" Scarlett said. He looked up at her. "There's a hidden compartment in the engine block," he said. "It was built in deliberately, and it's empty. But it wasn't always." She didn't laugh this time. Her arms uncrossed slowly. She took 2 steps toward him, stopped, and looked at the engine. "That's not possible," she said. "I can show you." She hesitated, just for a second, the length of a breath. Then she came forward and crouched down beside him in her expensive dress, which he noticed she did without hesitating or seeming to care about it, and she looked where he was pointing. For a long time, she didn't say anything. When she stood up, her face was different. Not the performative Scarlett Whitmore from 20 minutes ago. Something stripped back. "Who are you?" she said. "I told you. Mason Brooks. I run a garage in..." That's not what I mean. She was looking at him steadily. How do you know what you know? About this car? About what to look for? He stood up too, brushed off his jeans, old habit. I apprenticed under Carl Rigby, he said. For almost 4 years. He's the man who built this engine. Something happened in her face that she couldn't control. Just for a second, a flinch or something near it. Carl Rigby, she repeated. He died 6 years ago, Mason said. Heart failure. But before that, he was the best I ever saw. He built things to last, and he built them with intention. He looked at the engine. That compartment has a purpose. He put it there for a reason. Scarlett was quiet for a long time. You should go, she said finally. Her voice was flat again. Not cold exactly, but sealed, like a door that had been open and wasn't anymore. My people will arrange your compensation. Okay. He picked up his tools, started putting them back in the bag, then stopped. For what it's worth, whoever modified your fuel injection system knew what they were doing. This wasn't a random act of vandalism. Somebody targeted this car specifically. That's worth knowing. She didn't answer. He zipped up the bag and walked out of the garage, through the thinning party, past the valets who returned his truck with the same professional neutrality they'd received it with. He drove home through the dark Tennessee back roads with the windows down and the warm night air coming through and his mind running over everything he'd seen. The modified fuel injection, the hidden compartment, the color Carl had mixed with his own hands, lunar mist. He got home at 10:30. Mrs. Paget from next door had sat with Liam. She refused to call it babysitting at her age. She called it visiting, and Mason paid her in homemade dinners twice a week. He found Liam asleep on the couch with a book open on his chest, and Mrs. Paget watching television with the volume barely above nothing. Good evening, she said. Strange one, Mason said. He carried Liam to bed. The boy stirred but didn't wake, murmured something about dinosaurs, and settled back into sleep. Mason stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at him. Then he went to the kitchen and sat at the table and thought about a hidden compartment built by a dead man's hands. He thought about it for a long time. His phone buzzed at midnight. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Mr. Brooks, Scarlett Whitmore's voice. Stripped of the performance now, and what was underneath it was something that sounded like a person who hadn't slept. I found something. I need you to come back. Mason looked at the ceiling. When? He said. Tomorrow, she said. Please. He'd heard that word from her voice now. Please. And it didn't sound like the woman from the party. It sounded like someone who'd found something in the dark and didn't want to be alone with it. I'll be there at 9, he said. He hung up. Looked at the window. The night outside was the particular black of a Tennessee summer, deep and warm and pressing up against the glass like something that wanted in. He sat there another hour before he went to bed. The photographs were spread across the dining room table when Mason arrived at 9 the next morning. Dozens of them. Old prints with the slight color fade that happened to pictures taken in the early 90s, before everything went digital and nothing felt permanent anymore. Black and white workshop shots mixed in with color ones. A younger Carl Rigby standing beside engines, beside half-built frames, beside cars in various states of assembly. And in several of them, a man Mason didn't recognize, tall, silver-haired even then, laughing at something outside the frame with the easy laugh of someone who felt comfortable everywhere he went. My father, Scarlett said. She was standing at the far end of the table with a mug of coffee she wasn't drinking, just holding. She'd clearly been up most of the night. The performance from yesterday was completely gone now, and what was underneath it was someone who looked younger than 30 and more tired than she should be. Gerald Whitmore. He and Carl Rigby met in 1991. They were friends for almost 12 years. Mason picked up one of the photographs carefully. Carl, maybe 50 in the shot, holding a torque wrench and squinting into the light. The same squint Mason had spent 4 years watching across a workbench. He never mentioned your father, Mason said. Would he have? Scarlett asked. To an apprentice? It was a fair point, and not asked unkindly. Mason set the photograph back down. What else did you find? He said. She moved to the sideboard and picked up a folder. Manila, the old kind, worn at the edges like it had been handled many times. She set it on top of the photographs. Workshop records, she said. Carl's. My father kept copies, apparently. Everything from the build, parts sourced, hours logged, Specifications. I found them last night in my father's study, in a box I'd never opened. She paused. I never opened it because I thought it was just old business records. The box was labeled Vehicle Maintenance. Very boring label. How long has the box been there? Since he died. She said it flat, no inflection. 9 years of practice making that sentence feel like nothing. I kept his study the way it was. I don't know why. I told myself I'd deal with it eventually. Mason opened the folder. The records were Carl's handwriting. That particular cramped script that listed slightly left, which Mason had spent years learning to read. Part numbers, dates, measurements. And on the final page, something different. A note, written in the margin in pencil, small and almost casual, like an afterthought. Compartment sealed per GW's request. Contents verified. Lock before delivery. Mason stared at it. GW, he said. Gerald Whitmore. Scarlett came around the table and stood beside him, close enough that he could smell whatever she'd used to wash her hair. She looked at the margin note. He asked Carl to build the compartment, she said. My father. He had something to hide, and he built the hiding place into the engine of a car that nobody would touch because nobody could fix it. A car he loved, Mason said. A car he loved and trusted. She straightened up. The question is what was in it and where it went. Neither of them said the obvious thing, which was that whatever had been in that compartment, someone had gotten there first. Mason closed the folder and looked at the photographs again. His eyes moved over them slowly, the way he'd learned to look at engines, not looking for anything specific, just looking, letting the details come to him instead of hunting them. Who had access to the car after your father died, he said. Scarlett was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant she was being careful about what she said next and how she said it. The estate, she said. Richard Holloway managed everything immediately after my father's death. He was the executor of the will, the head of the family's financial management. He'd been my father's advisor for almost 20 years. She paused. He's still involved in the company. He sits on the board. How long after father died before the car went into storage? About 3 weeks. And in those 3 weeks, who had access to the garage? The quiet this time was longer. Richard would have, she said. As executor, he had access to everything. Mason didn't respond to that directly. He wasn't sure yet what shape this was taking, and he'd learned from watching Carl that you didn't make pronouncements until you were certain. Carl used to say that the most expensive thing a mechanic could do was be confident about the wrong answer. The principle applied to other things, too. I need to go back to the engine, Mason said. Look at some things I didn't fully examine last night, but I need to ask you something first. Ask. Do you actually want to know what I find? She looked at him sharply. Then her expression settled into something he was starting to recognize as her real face, more complicated than the party version, less certain about everything. That's a strange question, she said. Sometimes people think they do and then they don't. Whatever's in that engine, whatever was in that compartment, it points somewhere. And that somewhere might not be a place you want to go. He picked up his tool bag. I'm not trying to be dramatic. I'm just telling you that once we start pulling this apart, I don't know how to put it back the way it was. Scarlett was quiet for several seconds. My father is dead, she said. He's been dead for 9 years. If someone did something to him, or to his company, or to anything that was his, I want to know. She met his eyes steadily. I have always wanted to know. I just never had anything to look at before. Mason nodded once. Okay, he said. Show me the garage. She led him back through the house, through corridors lined with the accumulated evidence of serious money, art. He didn't know how to evaluate furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum, rugs that Mason automatically avoided the center of because they looked like the kind of thing you weren't supposed to walk on. He followed her through all of it without comment. The garage in the morning light was different from the night before, quieter. The controlled temperature made it feel slightly unreal, like a pocket of preserved air from another time. The Porsche sat where he'd left it, rear lid still raised, the engine exposed. Mason set his bag down beside it and put on his glasses, reading glasses, which he'd needed since he was 28 and which he didn't like wearing in front of people, a vanity he recognized as stupid and maintained anyway. Then he got to work. Scarlett sat on a workbench stool and watched him. She didn't try to make conversation, which he appreciated. she just watched. She had the ability to be still without fidgeting, which in his experience was less common than it should be. He started from the beginning, this time with better light and more time and the knowledge of what he was looking for. He went through the engine systematically, not rushing, not skipping, the way Carl had drilled into him. Every component tells you something. Don't assume you already know what it's saying. After about 40 minutes, Scarlett said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Last night, when I said what I said, in front of everyone." He didn't look up from what he was doing. "The marriage thing?" "Yes." A pause. "I'm sorry. I was performing, and you were an easy target, and I'm not proud of it." Mason considered the apology. It was a real one, not the kind that was actually an explanation, not the kind that was really asking him to say it was fine, just an acknowledgement. "It wasn't the worst thing anyone said to me," he said. "That doesn't make it right." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." Another silence. He kept working. "You didn't react," she said. "Most people would have reacted." He thought about that for a second. "I had more interesting things to look at," he said, and nodded toward the engine. She made a sound that might have been a short laugh. He wasn't entirely sure. He found the second point of sabotage 45 minutes in, a different system this time, the ignition timing, modified in a way that would have appeared as normal degradation over time. Whoever had done this had done it in layers spread across multiple systems. If you examined any single component in isolation, you might convince yourself it was just age. You had to look at the whole picture. "Two separate systems," he said, not fully explaining, mostly thinking out loud. "And the compartment. That's three things. Three separate acts of deliberate interference." Scarlett got off the stool and came to stand beside him. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means whoever did this came back more than once," Mason said. "Or they were very thorough on a single visit. Either way, they knew the car. They knew how to get in there without leaving obvious marks." He paused. "This wasn't someone who just wanted the car to not run. Someone who just wanted that would have cut a wire. This was someone who wanted it to look like natural failure. Someone covering something up." The words landed between them and sat there. Scarlett reached past him and touched the edge of the engine compartment, not grabbing anything, just touching it, like she was trying to make something real that still felt theoretical. "The compartment," she said. "Whatever was inside it, my father put it there because he was afraid someone might look for it in his office, in the obvious places." She withdrew her hand. He was hiding something from someone specific. "Someone with access to the obvious places," Mason said. She stepped back. She crossed her arms, and this time it wasn't the defended posture from the night before. It was someone pulling themselves together, reaching for something steady. "Richard," she said. The name came out flat, not a question. "I don't know that," Mason said carefully. "I know someone with knowledge of this car and access to this garage got into that compartment. I know it wasn't done carelessly. I can't tell you who." He looked at her. "But you're saying Holloway had that access." "He had access to everything," she said. Her voice had gone very quiet. "My father trusted him completely. 40 years they worked together. He was at the funeral. He cried." She said the last word like it tasted like something she hadn't expected. Mason didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. He went back to the engine. He went through the rest of it slowly and carefully, and at the bottom of his search, in a place that required him to reach further into the engine block than was comfortable, his fingers found something he hadn't expected. Not a compartment this time. Not a modification. A photograph, small and folded and sealed inside a waterproof plastic sleeve, tucked into a gap in the engine casing that must have been deliberately widened by a millimeter or two to accommodate it. Someone had found the main compartment and emptied it, but they'd missed this. He worked it free carefully. His hands were shaking slightly, which surprised him. He wasn't a person whose hands shook usually. He stood up and held it out to Scarlett. She took it from him and peeled the plastic sleeve open with fingers that weren't entirely steady either. Unfolded the photograph. It was a picture of two men at a table covered in papers. Mason didn't recognize either of them at first glance, but Scarlett clearly did, because she went very still in the way people go still when their body processes something before their mind catches up. "That's my father," she said, "and that's Richard." She turned the photograph over. On the back, in her father's handwriting, Mason recognized the style from the other documents she'd shown him. A date and 3 words. He knows everything. The temperature in the garage hadn't changed. The system running in the walls kept it at 68 degrees, same as it had always been. But Mason felt cold standing there. "That's 9 months before he died," Scarlett said. She was still looking at the back of the photograph. Her voice was perfectly level in the way voices get perfectly level when the alternative is falling apart. 9 months before the cardiac event that his doctors said came out of nowhere for a man in excellent health. Mason thought about that word. Cardiac. He thought about what it would take to make a cardiac event look like it came out of nowhere. He didn't say any of that out loud. He wasn't a doctor, and he wasn't an investigator, and he was standing in a garage in Tennessee holding a single photograph that proved two men sat at a table together, which by itself proved nothing at all. But the look on Gerald Whitmore's face in that photograph, caught unaware, turned slightly toward the camera he clearly hadn't known was there, was the look of a man who was afraid. Mason had seen that look before. He'd seen it in the mirror once, in the worst year after his wife died, when everything felt like it was coming apart at the seams, and there was a 9-year-old boy asleep down the hall, counting on him to hold it together. He'd pulled himself out of that eventually, but he remembered the face. Gerald Whitmore hadn't had time to pull himself out of anything. "We need to find out what was in the main compartment," Mason said. Scarlett looked up from the photograph. "We don't have what was in it," she said. "No, but we know your father built it, and we know he trusted Carl to seal it, and Carl was meticulous." Mason picked up the workshop folder again, flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for. A single hand-drawn schematic, engine components labeled in Carl's cramped script. Carl documented everything. The compartments here in the schematic. If he built it to hold something specific, the dimensions tell us something about what that something was. Scarlett came and looked over his shoulder at the schematic. She smelled like coffee and something else, something he didn't have a name for, and he was aware of her being close in the same way he was aware of the cold feeling that hadn't left his chest, both of them just facts that were present. "Documents," she said, studying the dimensions Mason was pointing to. "The space is about the right size for folded documents. Not thick ones, thin. Photographs. Paper records. Financial records," Mason said. She was quiet for a moment. "He was a numbers man," she said finally. "My father. He built the company from 40 employees to 400. He understood money the way some people understand language. It was how he thought about everything." She touched the schematic lightly with one finger. "If he found something wrong in the books, in the accounts, he would have documented it. He would have made copies of the originals and put them somewhere safe." "And then someone found out he'd found out," Mason said, "and took the documentation before it could go anywhere." She straightened up. "But they left this." She held up the small photograph. "Because they didn't look far enough," Mason said. "Whoever searched the engine knew about the main compartment. Maybe your father told them. Maybe they found it on their own. But they didn't search the engine itself. They didn't think to look in the gaps." "My father knew that," Scarlett said softly. "He knew someone who found the compartment might stop looking." She looked at the photograph in her hand. "He was careful. He was always careful." Her voice went slightly rough at the edges for just a second before she smoothed it back. "He just didn't have enough time." The garage was very quiet. The temperature control system ran its soft background hum, and outside, through the closed doors, somewhere distant on the property, someone was mowing something. Mason wiped his hands on a rag and looked at the Porsche. It sat there under the morning light looking exactly like what it was. A beautiful machine that someone had deliberately broken, filled with the last traces of a dead man's warnings. "I can fix the engine," he said. "The sabotage. I can reverse it. Not quickly. Some of the parts will need to be sourced and one component will need to be fabricated. But I can make it run again." He paused. "Whether that matters right now is your call." Scarlett looked at the car for a long moment. "It matters," she said. "It always mattered." She folded the small photograph carefully and held it. "My father wanted it to run. That was the point of the whole thing. He spent 2 years working with Carl on this car. He used to say he was building it for me, for when I was old enough to appreciate it." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I didn't understand what he meant until just now." Mason didn't ask her to explain. He thought he understood. "I need to show you something else," she said. "Come inside." He followed her back through the house, through a different corridor this time, to a room off the main hall that had clearly been her father's study. Dark wood, books on 3 walls, a desk that faced the door the way powerful men tended to position desks. The box she'd found the previous night was still open on the desk. She went past it to a framed photograph on the wall that he hadn't noticed when they'd been through earlier. It was Carl Rigby. Not a studio portrait, a candid shot, taken in a workshop, Carl mid-gesture, explaining something to someone outside the frame. He looked 60, maybe 62. His hands were in the air, and his expression was the expression Mason knew best from him. That particular look of being completely absorbed in what he was talking about. Under the photograph, a small brass plate. Carl Rigby. The man who built things that last. Mason stood in front of it for a while without saying anything. He hadn't known Carl had known Gerald Whitmore this well. Hadn't known there was a photograph of Carl in the study of a man like this. Carl had never talked about the wealthy clients, had never dropped names or told stories about who he'd built things for. He'd been oddly private about it, which Mason had always attributed to discretion. He was starting to wonder now if it had been something else. "How much do you know about how Carl died?" Scarlett said. Mason turned from the photograph. "Heart failure," he said. "He was 68. He'd had problems with his heart for years." "Did you know him well at that point, toward the end?" "We'd lost touch," Mason said. "After I opened my own shop, we kept in contact for a while, but then—" He stopped. He thought about those years. His wife getting sick, the hospital bills, the way everything had contracted to just the immediate thing in front of him, getting through each day. "Life got complicated. I should have stayed in better contact." Scarlett was watching him. "He died 14 months after my father," she said carefully. "I didn't think anything of it at the time. Now I'm wondering if I should have." The cold feeling was back, spreading into his shoulders. "What are you saying?" he said. "I'm not saying anything definite," she said. "I'm saying I have a photograph of my father 9 months before he died and 3 words on the back, and the man who built the hiding place for whatever my father found died 14 months later, and the hiding place was emptied by someone who had access to this estate." She paused. "I'm saying I've spent 9 years not asking questions, and I think I made a mistake." Mason looked back at Carl's photograph on the wall. He thought about 4 years of learning beside that man, about patience and precision, and the particular way Carl talked about craftsmanship, like it was a moral principle, not just a skill, about a man who built things to last and apparently built one last thing that someone wanted very badly to make sure was never found. He should call his lawyer, he thought, or rather he should have a lawyer to call. He didn't have one. He had a garage, a kid, and a mortgage that was 2 months from becoming a conversation he didn't want to have. He also had a photograph of a dead man's fear and an empty compartment that used to hold something someone killed for. "Okay," he said. He said it the way he always said it when he'd decided something, quiet, more to himself than anyone else. "What else is in that box?" Scarlett looked at him. "I haven't finished going through it," she said. "Then let's go through it," Mason said. They spent the next 2 hours at the desk, going through everything in the box, paper by paper, photograph by photograph, the accumulated filing of a man who'd kept things he considered important. Most of it was ordinary. Warranty records, old correspondence, receipts for the car going back to when it was first commissioned. But near the bottom of the box, underneath a stack of old automotive magazines that Gerald Whitmore had apparently collected, they found a sealed envelope. Not sealed with the flap, sealed with tape, multiple strips of it, the kind of sealing that meant something. Scarlett held it in both hands and looked at it. Her name was on the front, her father's handwriting. The ink was faded but still completely legible. Scarlett, if something happens to me. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Mason stood back. This felt like the kind of thing that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the woman sitting at her father's desk, holding an envelope she'd never known existed. He waited. He gave her the space. She opened it slowly, working the tape free carefully, not tearing anything. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. She read it. He watched her face. Whatever was on that paper took her 2 minutes to read. He watched her expression move through several things in those 2 minutes. Something that started as controlled went through surprised, went through something he could only describe as grief, and came out the other side as something harder and quieter that he didn't have a word for yet. She set the letter down on the desk when she was finished. She put both hands flat on the wood on either side of it and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she said, Richard has been stealing from the company for 23 years. Mason didn't say anything. My father found out. He'd found out about 8 months before he died. He had documentation, the original financial records, copies of transfers, account numbers. He'd hidden everything in the engine. She looked at the letter without touching it. He says in this letter, he says he was waiting until he had everything he needed before he went to the authorities. He didn't want to accuse Richard without being absolutely certain. He wanted the case to be watertight. She stopped. He never got there, Mason said. He never got there. Her voice was steady. It was the kind of steady that took real effort, and she was putting in the effort. The letter says if something happens to him, not to trust Richard, not to let him near the estate, near the company, near anything. She looked up. Richard was the executor of the will. He was the first person called when my father died. He handled everything. Mason thought about a man with access to an estate in the 3 weeks before a car went into storage. A man who knew his crimes had been documented and needed to find where the documentation was hidden. He thought about the empty compartment. He thought about Carl Rigby dying 14 months later. He thought about the word cardiac and what it would take to make one look like it came out of nowhere. We need to be careful, he said. This letter and that photograph, that's what we have right now. It's not nothing, but it's not enough on its own. Richard has lawyers and he has influence and he's had 9 years to make himself untouchable. He paused. If he finds out you know, and we don't have enough to stop him. I know, Scarlett said. She stood up from the desk. She was pulling something together inside herself. He could see it happening, the performative CEO version of her clicking back into place, but underneath it now was something real and purposeful that hadn't been there the night before. My father left one more thing in the letter. He says the strongest evidence, the originals, were in the engine compartment, the ones Richard took. She looked at Mason. But he also says there's a second set. Mason waited. At the cabin, she said, the lake cabin. He used to take me there every summer when I was a child. He says in the letter, he says beneath the floorboard in the back bedroom, there's a second copy of everything. She met his eyes. He built a backup, because he knew if something happened, whoever took the engine copies would think they'd won. Mason was quiet for a moment. How far is the cabin? He said. 4 hours north, she said, in the mountains. When can we go? She looked at the letter one more time, then she folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. My son's with me, Mason said. He's got school Monday, but this weekend... I know, she said. Bring him. Something in her face shifted slightly when she said it. Something that hadn't been there before. Something softer that she didn't seem aware of. We'll go Saturday morning. She handed him back the sealed envelope and held his gaze for just a second longer than necessary. Mason, she said, and it was the first time she'd used his first name. Thank you. For coming back. He looked at the photograph of Carl Rigby on the wall. The man explaining something to someone, hands in the air, completely absorbed in what he was saying. The man who built things that last. He would have wanted someone to find it, Mason said. He meant Carl. He wasn't entirely sure she knew that. She looked at the photograph too. Both of them would have, she said quietly. Mason picked up his bag from the floor by the door. Outside, the property was bright with late morning sun, and somewhere on the grounds the mowing had stopped, leaving a silence that felt suddenly very wide and very open. He sat in his truck for a moment before he started it, looking at nothing in particular. Then he pulled out his phone and called Liam's school to arrange a Monday absence. Saturday came in gray and heavy, the kind of morning that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain. Mason had the truck packed before 6, a bag for him, a bag for Liam, the tool roll he brought everywhere out of habit, even when he had no reason to think he'd need it. He made sandwiches because Liam didn't eat well when he was hungry and bored simultaneously, and 4 hours in a car with a 9-year-old who was both hungry and bored was a particular kind of suffering Mason had experienced enough times to plan around. Liam came downstairs at 6:15 with his hair doing 3 different things and his shoes on the wrong feet. You're excited, Mason said. I'm not excited, Liam said, fixing his shoes without being asked. I just woke up fast. Right. Is she going to be there? Ms. Whitmore, yeah, it's her cabin. Liam considered this with the gravity that 9-year-olds applied to things they were actually thinking about carefully. Is she nice? Mason thought about the party, about the champagne and the laughter, and I'll marry you. Then he thought about the study, about two hands flat on a desk, about the particular effort of keeping your voice steady when you've just read something that changes the shape of everything. She's complicated, he said. That usually means nice but hard, Liam said. Mason looked at his son. Yeah, he said. That's pretty much it. Scarlett was waiting at the estate gate at 6:30 in a dark SUV that was newer than anything Mason had ever driven. She had coffee, 2 cups, one of which she held out to Mason through the window before she'd even said good morning, and a juice box that she offered to Liam with a slightly uncertain expression, like she wasn't fully sure if 9-year-olds drank juice boxes or if that was too young. Liam took it without ceremony and said, "Thanks," and went back to looking out the window. "He's easy," Mason said. "I wasn't sure what to bring," Scarlett said. She looked at the juice box in Liam's hand like she was filing information away. "I don't spend much time around children." "You did fine," Mason said. They took her SUV, leaving Mason's truck at the estate. Scarlett drove, which surprised Mason slightly. He'd half expected a driver. But she slid into the seat with the practiced ease of someone who drove herself everywhere and preferred it. She was in jeans and a plain dark sweater, hair down, no jewelry. Without the dress and the performance, she looked like a different person. More real, less like a magazine cover. The first hour passed mostly in silence, which was comfortable enough. Liam fell asleep almost immediately, which was his particular superpower in any moving vehicle. Scarlett drove steadily. The interstate gave way to 2-lane roads that wound into the Tennessee mountain foothills, and the gray sky sat low over everything like it was listening. "Did you tell anyone where we're going?" Mason asked after a while. Scarlett's hands shifted slightly on the wheel. "No." "Richard Holloway. Does he know about the cabin?" "Of course he does. He was my father's closest associate for 40 years. She paused. "But he doesn't know what we found in the study. And he doesn't know about the letter." "How sure are you?" She glanced at him sideways. "Not completely," she said, and the honesty in it was the kind that cost something. Mason looked out at the trees. They were thickening as the road climbed, the roadside vegetation going from maintained to wild. "Have you talked to him recently?" Mason said. "Holloway. He called me Thursday. Routine board matter, or what he said was routine. He does that, calls every week or two, checks in." She said the phrase with a flatness that communicated exactly what she thought the calls were actually about. "I didn't mention the box or the photographs. I told him I was thinking of restoring my father's car. He said that sounded lovely." "And?" "And nothing. He said it sounded lovely and moved on." She was quiet for a moment. Richard is very good at seeming like nothing is happening when everything is happening. He's had 40 years of practice. Mason thought about that. About a man who had sat at a funeral and cried for someone he'd spent 23 years stealing from, who had perhaps, and the perhaps was doing significant work in Mason's head, done something worse than steal from. In the back seat, Liam made a small sound in his sleep and turned toward the window, one cheek pressed against the glass. Mason watched him for a second. He had his mother's nose. That was the kind of thing Mason noticed at random moments and then didn't know what to do with. "He asked about you," Scarlett said. Mason turned back. "What?" "Richard, when he called Thursday. I mentioned I'd hired a mechanic to look at the Porsche, and he asked who." She kept her eyes on the road. "I told him your name. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I do now." The inside of the car felt slightly smaller. "Did you give him any other information?" Mason said. "No, just your name." She glanced at him. "I'm sorry, I didn't know then what I know now." "It's fine," Mason said, "because it was what you said." He spent the next 20 miles thinking about whether it was actually fine and arriving at the unsatisfying conclusion that he had no idea. The cabin was 4 hours and 20 minutes door to door, which meant they arrived just past 11 with the sky still undecided and the mountain air carrying enough chill that Mason wished he'd brought a heavier jacket. The property was down a gravel road that needed work. Potholes, overgrowth pressing in from both sides. One section where a tree branch had come down and been dragged to the shoulder without being fully cleared. The kind of road that hadn't been driven regularly in years. The cabin itself was smaller than Mason had expected. Not a wealthy man's retreat so much as a place where a wealthy man had chosen to not be wealthy for a while. Simple wood construction, a covered porch, a stone chimney, windows that looked out toward a lake, maybe 200 yards down a slope through the trees. The water was flat and gray under the flat gray sky. Liam was awake by the time they pulled up, looking out the window with the alert expression of a kid who smells something interesting. "Is there a boat?" he said. "There used to be," Scarlett said. She was looking at the cabin with an expression that had nothing to do with boats. "I haven't been here in 9 years." She got out first, stood on the gravel for a moment with her keys in her hand, just looking at it. Mason came around the truck and stood nearby, not saying anything, giving her whatever she needed to give herself. "We used to come every August," she said, not really to him. 2 weeks every summer. My father would fish, and I would absolutely refuse to fish, and we'd argue about it in the friendliest possible way. She made a small sound. "He always said the lake had good answers if you sat next to it long enough. I thought that was sentimental nonsense." She looked at the water through the trees. "I think I understand it better now." "Can we go to the lake?" Liam said. He'd appeared at Mason's elbow with the sudden materialization children managed. "After," Mason said. "We need to do something inside first." "After?" Liam looked at Scarlett. She was the variable here, the one he hadn't established rules with yet. "After," Scarlett confirmed. Something in how she said it, direct, no fuss, made Liam accept it immediately in the way he sometimes accepted things from people he'd immediately decided were worth listening to. Mason noticed this and filed it without comment. The cabin key was under the third porch board from the door, where Scarlett said it had always been kept, which was not a particularly sophisticated security measure, but had apparently worked for 9 years since nobody had broken in. The inside smelled like closed space and old wood and something faintly floral from whatever had been used to clean it last, years ago, now reduced to a ghost. It was neat despite the years. Someone, a caretaker, Scarlett said, an older man from the nearest town who checked on it twice a year, had kept the worst of the dust down and made sure the pipes didn't freeze in winter. The furniture was old and mismatched in the way of places that had accumulated things over decades rather than been decorated. A plaid couch, a coffee table with a ring stain that someone had tried to treat without full success. Photographs on the wall, family pictures, casual ones, the kind that ended up on cabin walls because they weren't good enough for the walls of places you actually tried to impress people with. Mason scanned the photographs as he moved through. Gerald Whitmore appeared in most of them, a tall man who photographed as someone larger than he probably was, with an easy smile and the look of someone who knew how to be comfortable in both a boardroom and a boat. In several pictures, a girl who was obviously Scarlett at various ages, 7, 10, maybe 13 in the last one, standing on the dock with a fish she'd apparently agreed to hold for the photograph despite her alleged refusal to fish. Scarlett was looking at the same photograph. She'd stopped in front of it without appearing to mean to. "You caught one eventually," Mason said. "He cheated," she said. "He put the line in while I wasn't looking and then handed it to me." A pause. "I knew he cheated. I didn't say anything because he was so pleased with himself." She pulled herself away from the photograph with a visible effort and moved toward the back of the cabin. The back bedroom was small, a single bed with a quilted cover, a window that looked directly at the lake between 2 trees, a rag rug on the floor in colors that had faded to a general impression of having once been brighter. The floorboard was in the corner under the bed, which meant they had to move the bed first, which was heavy and awkward and left them both slightly out of breath on the other side of it. Mason crouched and ran his hands along the floorboards. He found it quickly, the board that didn't sit flush with the others, a hairline gap on one edge that shouldn't have been there. He got his pocket knife into the gap and worked it up carefully. Underneath was a cavity about the size of a shoebox, cut into the subfloor with clean edges, lined with a thin sheet of metal that had kept the moisture out. Inside the cavity was a waterproof document bag, sealed. Inside the bag were papers, multiple sheets, documents with numbers and dates and account names, what looked like bank transfer records, official correspondence with headers. Mason didn't recognize, but that clearly meant something. Photographs of documents, a small notebook in the same handwriting as the margin note in Carl's workshop files, and a handwritten letter, longer than the one in the envelope from the study. Much longer. Scarlett sat cross-legged on the floor of the empty bedroom and read the letter while Mason looked through the other documents without fully understanding what he was looking at. The numbers were large. The dates ran back 23 years. There were account names, routing numbers, transfer amounts that Mason looked at once and looked away from because they were the kind of numbers that stopped feeling like money and started feeling like abstraction. He gave Scarlett time. He went to the doorway and looked out at the front room, where Liam had found a stack of old board games in a closet and was examining them with the focused attention of someone conducting an inventory. "Dad, there's a risk in here, but it's missing some pieces." "Don't touch the pieces, they'll go everywhere." "I'm not touching them, I'm looking." A pause. "Some of the countries are wrong. It's an old edition." "Why did they change the countries?" "Ask me later," Mason said. "I'm busy." "You're standing in a doorway," Liam said. Mason turned back to the bedroom. Scarlett had finished the letter. She was sitting with it in her lap, both hands on top of it, looking at the window and the gray lake and the trees. Her expression was the one he was starting to recognize as what happened when she ran out of ways to not feel something. "He knew," she said. "He knew Richard was going to come after him. He writes it. He says, if you're reading this, it means Richard found out what I know, and he chose to protect himself rather than face consequences." She stopped. Her jaw was tight. "He says he's sorry he can't protect me directly. He says the only protection he can give me is the truth written down in a place Richard won't think to look." She looked at the letter. "He says not to be afraid. He says Richard is a coward who built his life on other people's courage, and it will fall apart the moment anyone pulls a thread." She stopped talking. She was holding it together by a margin that was getting thin. "He was right," Mason said. "It's all there in those documents?" "Everything. 23 years of transfers to shell accounts, falsified invoices, payments to officials who approved the irregularities. Enough to—" She stopped again, started again. "Enough to put him away for a long time." She finally looked at Mason directly. "And one more thing." She reached into the document bag and pulled out a smaller envelope. This one wasn't addressed to her. It was addressed to a name Mason didn't recognize, a Dr. Elaine Marsh. "My father's physician died 2 years ago," Scarlett said. "But this envelope, he says in the letter that this envelope contains information he intended to send to her before he ran out of time. Information about symptoms he'd been experiencing in the weeks before his death." She set the envelope on her knee. Symptoms that his official autopsy didn't fully account for. The bedroom was very quiet. "He thought Richard poisoned him," Mason said. "He doesn't say that directly," Scarlett said. "He says he began experiencing symptoms he didn't understand, and he was afraid to tell anyone because he didn't know who he could trust. He says if an investigation ever occurs, this envelope should go to a forensic physician." She looked at the sealed envelope. "It has specific dates, specific descriptions of what he felt." Mason crouched down to be at her level because standing over someone when they're absorbing something like this felt wrong. "This is enough," he said. "All of this together. The letter, the financial records, the photographs, this envelope. This is what he built. He built it to last, Scarlett. Same as Carl built that engine." She looked at him. "We need to get this out of here," she said. "We need to make copies and get it to—" She stopped. "I need to call my attorney. My personal attorney, not the company's. The company's lawyers all report to the board, and Richard sits on the board." "Not from here," Mason said. "Not from this phone. If Holloway has any access to your communications—" "I know," she said. She was already pulling herself together, reorganizing, the competent, practical part of her taking over from the part that had been sitting on a cabin floor grieving her father all over again. "I have a burner. I bought one Thursday after I found the letter. I wasn't completely sure why at the time." She looked almost embarrassed by the practicality of it. "Turns out I had good instincts." "Turns out your father had good instincts too," Mason said. "You probably got it from him." Something moved through her face that wasn't quite a smile but was in that direction. She started repacking the document bag carefully. Mason helped. Methodical. The way he handled parts he couldn't replace. They were nearly done when his phone buzzed. An unknown number, same as Scarlett's call had been 2 nights ago. He almost let it go to voicemail. He didn't. "Mr. Brooks." The voice was male, older, smooth in the particular way of people who had spent decades being certain they were the most important person in any room. "My name is Richard Holloway. I believe you've been spending some time at the Whitmore estate." Mason didn't say anything for a moment. He was aware of Scarlett looking at him. She'd heard the name, or read it in his face, one of the two. "I have," Mason said. I understand you've been examining Gerald's old car. That's wonderful. It was a magnificent machine. Gerald loved it dearly. The warmth in the voice was professionally applied, like paint. I was hoping we might have a conversation, man to man, about your findings. I found a car that needs restoration work, Mason said. That's what I was hired for. Of course. A pause that communicated very clearly that Richard Holloway didn't believe a word of that. I'd like to meet. At your convenience. I'm prepared to make it worth your time quite substantially. Another pause. I understand you have a son, a young boy. It's difficult raising a child alone, financially demanding. The way he said it, not threatening exactly, just noting a vulnerability with the same casual precision as someone pressing a bruise to see what kind of pain it produced. Mason's hand tightened on the phone. I'm going to have to call you back, he said. I'm in the middle of something. He ended the call. Scarlett was watching him. She'd heard enough. He knows, she said. He knows something, Mason said. Maybe not everything, but enough to make a call. How did he get your number? He asked for my name Thursday, Mason said. The rest isn't hard if you have resources. Scarlett stood up. She had the document bag in her arms, and her expression had gone to something Mason hadn't seen before on her. Not fear exactly, but the hyper-alert focus of someone whose system has shifted from processing to responding. We need to leave, she said. Yeah, Mason said. He was already thinking through the drive, 4 hours back, the gravel road out, where a car could wait if someone wanted to wait. Get Liam. He went to the front room. Liam had set up Risk on the coffee table despite the missing pieces and was playing both sides against each other with the creative flexibility of a child who had never needed another person to make something work. We need to go, Mason said. Liam looked up. He read his father's face with the accuracy that kids developed when they'd spent years learning one person's expressions as their primary emotional weather report. Right now? He said. Yeah, come on, pack up your bag. Liam got up without argument. He looked at the Risk board, made a decision about what was happening, and began gathering the pieces back into the box with quick, careful hands. Dad, he said quietly, is something wrong? There might be, Mason said, because he didn't lie to Liam. He'd made that decision years ago, simplified things. We're going to be fine, but we need to move. Liam closed the Risk box and put it back on the shelf in the closet exactly where he'd found it, which was the kind of detail that Mason noticed because it was the kind of thing he'd never specifically taught the boy, and yet somehow the boy did it anyway. They were out the front door and onto the porch in under 3 minutes. The gravel road was where Mason had been thinking about. If someone wanted to box them in, the gravel road was the place. One way in, one way out, overgrowth on both sides, that fallen branch. He was almost to the SUV when he heard it. A sound from the tree line at the edge of the property, back toward where the gravel road met the main approach. Not a sound exactly, an absence of sound. Birds that had been making noise weren't anymore. Back inside, Mason said, low and even. Scarlett heard it in his voice. She didn't ask questions. She moved back toward the porch, and Mason put himself between her and the tree line without thinking about it. The same automatic positioning he'd have used to block a falling engine component, just where you needed to be. 2 men came out of the trees at the edge of the property. Not running. Walking with the deliberate, unhurried pace of people who had already decided how this was going to go and didn't need to rush. Both large. Both in dark clothing that wasn't quite a uniform but coordinated in the way of people who worked together. Mason had never been a fighter in any formal sense. He'd been in 2 fights in his life. Once in 10th grade that he'd lost badly. Once at 26 outside a bar in Mill Haven that he'd also lost but for a shorter period of time. He wasn't somebody who solved problems with his body, but he had a 9-year-old and 200 feet of open ground between the cabin porch and the lake path, and in a moment of pure clarity, he understood that the gravel road was already compromised, and the only direction that didn't have men in it was downhill. The lake, he said to Scarlett. Now, go. She went. Liam was already moving. He'd seen the men and made the same calculation and was 3 steps ahead of both adults, which was both alarming and briefly impressive. Mason was last off the porch, grabbing the document bag from Scarlett's hands so she could move faster. They went down the slope through the trees at something between a controlled run and a barely controlled fall, the ground uneven under the pine needles, branches at face level that Mason took because there was no time to duck. He heard movement behind them. Not close yet, but not far. The men weren't sprinting. They were covering ground efficiently, the pace of people who were confident about where this ended. The lake appeared through the trees, flat and gray and wide and unhelpful. A dock extended maybe 30 feet out over the water. Tied to the dock, listing slightly to one side, was a rowboat that had not been young when Gerald Whitmore was alive and had not improved with age. Liam reached the dock first. He looked at the boat, looked at Mason, looked at the boat again. "It's got a hole in it," he said. "How bad?" Mason said. Liam leaned over and looked. "Not super bad. Like a small hole." "Get in," Mason said. "Dad, get in the boat, Liam." They got in the boat. The oars were on the dock, which meant precious seconds getting them into the oar locks while the boat sat against the dock, and the lake lapped against the hull, and the hole in the bottom made itself known immediately as a thin, persistent trickle of cold water across the floorboards. Mason rowed. He was not an experienced rower, and the oarlocks were old and the oars were mismatched in length, which created a problem where the boat wanted to go left regardless of what he did. He corrected constantly, wasting effort, the boat moving in a series of arcing curves that would have been charming under any other circumstances. Behind them, the two men reached the dock and stopped. One of them pulled out a phone. Neither got into the water. "They're not following," Scarlett said, looking back. "Yet," Mason said. "There's no other boat," Scarlett said. "Give it time," Mason said, and kept rowing. The water that had come in through the hole was now covering the floorboards by half an inch. Liam had found an old coffee can under one of the seats and was bailing with remarkable composure for a 9-year-old in a leaking boat on a lake, while two men stood on a dock watching him. "You're doing great," Scarlett told him. "The can has a rust hole too," Liam said, without stopping bailing. "It's not as bad as the boat hole." Mason rowed. His arms were already burning. This was not a physical activity he had trained for. And the opposite shore, where the trees came down to the water's edge, was still a long way away. The gray sky sat over everything. The lake was cold enough that he could feel it through the hull boards where his feet rested. Halfway across, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He kept rowing. It buzzed twice more and stopped. Behind them, the two men on the dock had been joined by a third, who appeared to be giving instructions. After another minute, all three retreated back up the slope toward the cabin. "Why are they leaving?" Scarlett said. Mason didn't answer because he didn't know. He kept rowing. "They're going around," Scarlett said, working it out herself. "They're going back to the road, to come around the lake to the other side." "How far around is it?" Mason asked. "By road? 20 minutes at least. There's no direct road. You have to go back to the highway and come around." She looked at the far shore. "We'll be across before they get there." "We need a phone," Mason said. "Not yours, not mine. If Holloway has access to either number, he may be tracking location." Scarlett had her hand in her pocket already. "The burner." She held it up. "Who do you call?" Mason said. She was quiet for exactly 1 second. "My attorney," she said. "Personal, not company." She looked at the document bag in Mason's lap, wet at the bottom now from the water pooling on the floorboards. "And I'm going to need you to tell me that everything in there is still intact." Mason looked at the bag. The waterproof seal was holding. He could see the documents inside through the clear material, edges crisp. "It's intact," he said. Scarlett looked at the bag for a long moment. "My father built a backup," she said, half to herself. "Up," she said, half to herself. "Kept it somewhere quiet where no one would think to look, and waited for someone to come find it." 23 years, Mason said, thinking about Richard Holloway pressing that bruise over the phone. "I understand you have a son, financially demanding." "He waited 9 years more," Scarlett said. "He just needed the right person to look." Mason pulled on the oars and said nothing. The boat moved across the water in its imperfect arcing way, leaving behind a dock, a cabin full of someone's careful childhood summers, and two men who had already pulled out their phones to report that the evidence they'd been sent to retrieve was moving steadily across a gray lake in a leaking rowboat, getting further away by the minute. Liam bailed steadily with the rust-holed can and didn't complain once. The far shore came up slowly through the mist. The far shore was rocks and mud, and a tangle of roots where the trees came down hard to the waterline, and the boat hit it with a grinding sound that suggested the whole situation had not improved during the crossing. Mason stepped out first into ankle-deep water that was cold enough to make him catch his breath, pulled the bow up onto the rocks, and held it steady while Scarlett climbed out with the document bag held above her head, like she was fording a river. Liam stepped out last, looked down at his soaked shoes, and said nothing about them. That silence cost him something, Mason knew. Liam liked his shoes. "This way," Scarlett said, already moving into the tree line. She knew this lake, had known it since childhood, and she moved through the woods with the muscle memory of someone who had run these paths at 10 years old and hadn't entirely forgotten them at 30. Mason followed with Liam beside him, the document bag in his arms, his wet boots making sounds he'd rather not be making if sound was something they needed to control. The path Scarlett found wasn't much of a path, more a deer trail that had been used enough times by human feet to remember the shape of them. It curved uphill and away from the lake, through dense second-growth pine that blocked the sky entirely and made the gray morning feel like late afternoon. Mason's arms burned from the rowing. He didn't mention it. "There's a road about half a mile up," Scarlett said, not turning around. "It comes out near a gas station. I remember my father turning there every time we arrived." She pushed a low branch out of her way and let it swing back, and Mason caught it before it hit Liam in the face, which was the kind of automatic thing he'd been doing for 9 years. "From the gas station, we can call a car." "Use the burner," Mason said. "I know." He walked in silence for a few minutes. The ground was wet from whatever rain had fallen in the night, and the pine needles were slippery in patches. Liam slipped once and caught himself on a tree trunk without going down and without making a sound about it, which was the kind of thing that made Mason feel simultaneously proud and aware of how much his son had learned to just absorb without complaint. "You okay?" Mason said quietly. "My feet are wet," Liam said. "I know. I'm sorry." "It's okay." A pause. "Dad? Who were those men?" Mason had been waiting for this. Liam was the kind of kid who didn't ask immediately. He processed first, got his own thoughts in order, then asked when he had a real question rather than just a reaction. "They work for someone who doesn't want us to have what's in this bag," Mason said. Liam looked at the document bag. "Is it important?" "Yeah, very. More important than the car." "The car led to this. So yes." Liam was quiet for another few steps. "Are we in trouble?" he said. Mason thought about lying. It would have been easy, and Liam was 9, and there was a reasonable argument that 9 was too young to carry the weight of a real answer. But they had an agreement, unspoken but solid, built over years of Mason trying to be the kind of parent he'd wished for when he was 9, and scared and needed someone to level with him. "We were in trouble back there," Mason said. "We're less in trouble now, and by tonight we'll have taken steps that make those men's job a lot harder." Liam processed this. "Okay," he said. He meant it, which was the thing about Liam. When he said okay, he actually meant it. He decided to trust the assessment, and he was moving forward inside it. Mason didn't know where the boy had gotten that capacity. He hoped it wasn't from watching Mason fake it over the years and mistaking the performance for the real thing. The gas station materialized through the trees after 25 minutes of walking. A small single-pump operation with a hand-painted sign and a parking lot that held one pickup truck with a bumper sticker. Mason didn't read. Scarlett made the call from the burner in the parking lot, while Mason took Liam inside and bought him dry socks from a rack near the register that stocked dry socks. Apparently because this was the kind of country where arriving somewhere with wet feet was a normal enough occurrence to be prepared for. Liam changed his socks in the gas station bathroom and came out looking marginally better about the world. "You want something?" Mason said, gesturing at the cooler. "Gatorade," Liam said. "The blue kind if they have it." They had it. Mason bought 2, handed one to Liam, stood by the window watching the parking lot and the road, and waited. Scarlett came back in with the burner in her hand, and her expression set in the careful neutral that he'd come to understand meant she was in control of something that was costing her to control. "My attorney is Thomas Hargrove," she said. "I've used him for personal legal matters for 4 years. He has no connection to the company, and Richard has never had any reason to contact him." She sat down on the edge of a display cooler. "He's driving up himself. Won't arrive until tonight, so we need somewhere to wait that isn't the cabin and isn't the estate. Where? She looked at him. You tell me. You know this part of Tennessee. I don't. Mason thought. Mason. There was a motel in Cartwright, the nearest town of any size, 30 miles south, functional if not distinguished, the kind of place that ran on cash payments and didn't ask unnecessary questions. He'd stayed there once during a breakdown job years back. He remembered the woman at the desk, heavy-set and businesslike, who had handed him a key and told him checkout was 11 without a flicker of interest in who he was or what he was doing there. I know a place, he said. The car Scarlett had called arrived 20 minutes later, a rideshare driven by a young man in a university sweatshirt who either didn't notice or didn't care that his 3 passengers were damp, carrying a waterproof document bag, and had come out of the woods on foot. He was playing music through the car speakers at a volume just below conversation level and spent the drive watching the road in the forthright way of someone being paid to get somewhere without incident. Mason appreciated that. The motel in Cartwright was as he remembered. Single story, 12 rooms, a vending machine outside that stocked things no one had specifically requested but everyone occasionally needed. The woman at the desk wasn't the same woman he'd dealt with years before but ran on the same frequency. Keys, room number, checkout at 11, have a good one. Cash accepted, no problem. They took 2 rooms. Mason and Liam in one, Scarlett next door. The rooms were what they were, clean enough, functional. The kind of carpet that had been chosen for durability rather than aesthetics. Mason set the document bag on the table by the window and sat down and looked at it. Liam sat on the bed and drank his Gatorade and turned on the television at a low volume to a channel showing nature documentaries, which was Liam's default when he needed to decompress. Mason pulled out his phone. He looked at it for a long moment, then put it face down on the table. Richard Holloway had his number. Richard Holloway had his name. Richard Holloway had sent 2 men to a mountain cabin on a Saturday morning, which meant Richard Holloway had been watching Scarlett's movements in some capacity. Either her phone, her car, or someone on the estate who reported to him. 23 years of building a network of covered tracks didn't leave a person without resources. He thought about the call, about the voice, that smooth applied warmth. I understand you have a son, financially demanding. It hadn't been a threat. It had been something more careful than a threat. It had been an inventory, delivered out loud, of the things Mason valued, and therefore the things that could be used to move him. There was a knock at the connecting door. Scarlett. Come in, Mason said. Liam looked up from the television and looked back. She came in with the burner in her hand and sat in the chair across from him. She'd dried off and pulled her hair back, and she looked like someone who had been through a difficult morning and was holding the pieces together with precision rather than ease. I need to tell you something, she said, before Thomas gets here, before this goes wherever it goes. She set the burner down on the table. Richard called again, on my regular phone. Mason waited. He was pleasant, she said, with a weight on that word that communicated everything about what kind of pleasant. He said he was concerned about me, said he'd heard I'd been at the cabin and that the road up there was dangerous and he hoped I was all right. She looked at the burner. He said that he'd always thought of me as family, that my father would have wanted him to look after me. A pause. He said that sometimes, in complicated estates, there were records that could be taken out of context, financial records especially, and that if I'd found anything that seemed confusing, he'd be happy to sit down and explain. He's giving you a way out, Mason said. He's giving me a chance to pretend I don't know what I know, Scarlett said, which is the same thing he's been doing for 9 years, banking on my not knowing, or not looking, or looking and then being too afraid of what he controls to do anything about it. Are you afraid? Mason said. Not to challenge her, just because it was a real question, and she deserved to have real questions asked. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. I'm not going to pretend I'm not. He has people on his payroll who showed up at a cabin in the mountains on a Saturday morning because he made a phone call. He has lawyers who have protected him for decades. He has relationships with people in positions that make prosecution complicated. She looked at Mason directly. I'm afraid of what happens if we get this wrong. What happens if you do nothing? Mason said. She looked at the document bag on the table. He wins, she said, And my father's name stays attached to a company that Richard hollowed out for 23 years. And whatever he did to make sure my father never testified goes unanswered. She straightened slightly. I can't do nothing. I've been doing nothing for 9 years and I didn't even know it. Mason nodded once. There was nothing to add to that. He's going to call you again, she said. Richard, he'll try you directly because I didn't give him what he needed from my call. He'll offer you something real. Money, probably. Enough to matter. She met his eyes. I need to know, Mason. Not because I don't trust you, because I need to know what you're going to say so I can plan around it. It was a fair question, asked the right way. Not insultingly, not with performance, just cleanly. I'm going to tell him no, Mason said. He'll offer more. Then I'll tell him no again. She looked at him for a moment. Why? She said. You have a mortgage, you have a son, you have a garage that's 12 months from being a real business or not. He'll offer you enough to make all of that not a problem anymore. She wasn't saying it to tempt him. She was saying it the way she said most things, directly, because she respected him enough not to pretend the variables weren't real. Why is that not worth considering? Mason thought about his wife, Sarah, in the last year of her illness, about the particular degradation of watching someone become less of themselves in increments, and the way he'd kept going to work every day because the bills were what they were and grief didn't suspend the mortgage. About the night he'd sat at the kitchen table with the numbers in front of him and understood, clearly and without drama, that he was not going to be able to make it work on paper, and had made it work anyway through sheer repetition of effort, one day after the next, because Liam was asleep down the hall and needed breakfast in the morning. He thought about what it would mean to take money from the man who had taken a father from a woman and possibly engineered the death of the person who had taught Mason everything he knew about building things that lasted. Because I'd know, he said, every day after. Every time Liam asked me why I was in a better mood, or why we could afford something we couldn't afford before, I'd know what I traded for it. He looked at the table. I'm not built to carry that. Scarlett was quiet. Okay, she said. It came out softer than her usual register. You should sleep, Mason said. Thomas won't be here until tonight. You've been up since Thursday, more or less, she said. She stood, picking up the burner. Then she stopped and looked at Liam on the bed, who had fallen most of the way asleep against the headboard, with the Gatorade still in his hand and a documentary about African migration playing at low volume. He's a good kid, she said. Yeah, Mason said. He is. You're a good father. She said it simply, not as a compliment exactly, more as an observation she'd been holding for a while and decided to say out loud. I notice things like that. I didn't have a bad one, so I know what it looks like. She went back through the connecting door and closed it softly. Mason carefully extracted the Gatorade from Liam's hand without waking him, turned the television off, and sat back down at the table to wait. Richard Holloway called at 3:17 in the afternoon. Mason had been expecting it, had been sitting with the phone on the table, watching it, the same way he sat with an engine component he was waiting to understand. When it buzzed, he picked it up on the second ring. Mr. Brooks? The same voice, same applied warmth. I hope the rest of your Saturday has been more comfortable than the morning. So he knew about the lake. Or he knew enough to imply it, which was the same thing functionally. It's been fine, Mason said. Good. A pause with something deliberate in it. I'll be direct if that suits you. I'm a direct man. Gerald always appreciated that about me. I find that men who work with their hands usually prefer it. Mason said nothing. He'd found over the years that silence in a conversation was a tool most people didn't know how to use and couldn't handle being on the receiving end of. Holloway filled it, as Mason had expected. You've found some documents, Holloway said. Old financial records. The kind of records that, without context, can appear quite alarming. I understand completely why Scarlett is upset. She loved her father, and these records touch on his legacy, and that's emotional. Another pause. But these are old internal documents from a complicated period in the company's history. There are explanations for everything in them. I've been managing that company for 4 decades, Mr. Brooks. I know where every dollar went and why. I'm sure you do, Mason said. A slight adjustment in the warmth. Almost imperceptible. I'd like to resolve this quietly, for everyone's benefit. Scarlett's benefit most of all. She doesn't need an ugly public investigation hanging over her company. Shareholders get nervous. Markets move. Reputations take damage whether or not anything improper actually occurred. Is that a threat to her company? Mason said. It's an observation about how the world works, Holloway said smoothly. I've watched it work for a long time. He shifted registers again, down toward something that was trying to be man-to-man, conspiratorial, just two people being honest. I understand your situation, Mr. Brooks. I want you to understand that I mean that genuinely. A single father, a small business, a child to raise. I've looked into your circumstances, and I have nothing but respect for what you've built under difficult conditions. He'd looked into his circumstances. Mason kept his face neutral, which was easy since there was no one to see his face. I'm prepared to offer you $750,000, Holloway said, placed in an account of your choosing within 48 hours of our coming to a resolution. Your garage would be secure. Your son's future would be secure. Everything you've been carrying alone for years would simply lift. Liam was asleep on the bed. Mason could hear him breathing from across the room, the slow, even breath of a child who trusted that the world was being handled. $750,000 was not an abstract number. Mason knew exactly what it meant. The mortgage, gone. The equipment he'd been deferring for 2 years, bought. Liam's college, funded before the boy was old enough to know what college was. The specific exhausted arithmetic of being a single parent with a small business would simply, as Holloway said, lift. He sat with that for exactly the amount of time it took to feel the weight of it fully and understand that the weight didn't change anything. No, Mason said. Silence on the line. Mr. Brooks, no, Mason said again. Not at 750, not at anything else you'd want to add to it. No. The warmth was gone now. What was underneath it was something flatter and more honest and considerably less pleasant. You're making a decision with significant consequences, Holloway said. For yourself and for people close to you. I want to make sure you understand that clearly. I understand it clearly, Mason said. You sent men to the cabin this morning. You called me to tell me you know about my son. You're telling me now that consequences exist. I understand all of it. He kept his voice even. He wasn't performing bravery. He was just saying the true thing, which was that none of it changed the answer. What I have in this room goes to a very good attorney tonight. That attorney will make copies and distribute them to investigators, journalists, and members of the Whitmore board who I'm told are not on your payroll. And then you'll have a very different kind of morning than you had today. A long silence. You have no idea what you're involved in, Holloway said. The smoothness was completely gone. What was left was something older and meaner and more recognizable for what it was. I know exactly what I'm involved in, Mason said. A dead man spent the last months of his life building something that could outlast him. I know what that looks like. I know how much it costs and what it means. He thought about Carl, hands too arthritic to hold a wrench, still finding ways to teach. He thought about Gerald Whitmore sealing a compartment inside an engine and trusting the craftsmanship to hold. You underestimated them both. You're underestimating us now. He ended the call. His hands were entirely steady, which surprised him. Liam stirred on the bed and opened his eyes halfway. Dad? Still here? Mason said. Okay. The boy closed his eyes again. Mason set the phone down on the table. Through the connecting door he heard Scarlett moving. She'd been awake, he suspected, and heard enough through the thin wall to know what had happened. A moment later she knocked. Come in, he said. She came in and looked at him and didn't ask. I told him no, Mason said. She exhaled. Not dramatically, just a single breath of something that had been held. Then we do this right, she said. All of it. The investigators, the board members, the journalists. Everyone at the same time so he can't contain it before it spreads. Your attorney tonight, Mason said. And we make the copies before he arrives, so if anything happens on the road... The gas station had a copier, Scarlett said. Behind the register. I noticed it when we were there. Of course she had. We go back and make copies, Mason said. Then we have Thomas tonight, and we make the calls. He looked at the document bag. Your father wrote a letter to a forensic physician that goes to someone who can act on it. I know someone, Scarlett said. I've been thinking about who I know who's completely outside Richard's network. There's a physician in Nashville. She teaches at the university. She's testified as a forensic expert in 3 major cases in the last 10 years, and she has never had any professional contact with Richard or anyone connected to him. She held the burner. I haven't met her personally, but I can get to her through two connections I trust. Can you reach her tonight? I can reach her connection tonight. She'll be in contact by tomorrow. She looked at Mason. This is going to be a fight. Even with everything in that bag, he has resources and relationships and 9 years of careful self-protection. It's not going to be simple. I know, Mason said. You don't have to be in it past tonight, she said. Once Thomas has the documents and the process is in motion, you can step back. You've done more than you should have had to do. You're a mechanic in Millhaven who got an invitation to look at a car. Mason looked at her. I was also, he said, an apprentice to a man who built something important and then died in a way that might not have been as simple as it looked, and I didn't know that until this week. He paused. I'm not stepping back. Something moved through her expression that she didn't bother to control this time. Okay, she said. Thomas Hargrove arrived at 9:43 in a car that was practical rather than impressive, which Mason decided was a good sign in an attorney. He was 60-something, gray at the temples, with the specific manner of someone who had spent decades in rooms where bad news was delivered and had learned to receive it with whatever it deserved rather than whatever made people feel better. He shook Scarlett's hand, shook Mason's, looked at Liam asleep on the bed, and turned his attention to the document bag with the focused efficiency of someone who understood exactly what he was being handed. He went through everything at the table for 40 minutes. He asked 12 questions. He took his own photographs of every document with a camera that was not connected to any network. He read the father's letter twice and the sealed envelope for the forensic physician 3 times. Then he sat back and said, "This is substantial." "Is it enough?" Scarlett said. "For investigation?" "Absolutely." "For prosecution?" He considered. "The financial records alone are enough to open a federal case. The letter establishes intent and timeline. The envelope goes to a forensic expert before anything else. If what Gerald Whitmore was experiencing in those final weeks is consistent with specific compounds, and if there are any retrievable records from the original autopsy," he stopped himself. "One thing at a time. Tonight I take these, make certified copies through my firm's secure system, and they go by morning to 3 separate investigators I trust personally. Not professionally, personally." "And Richard?" Scarlett said. "Wakes up on a Tuesday not knowing this is coming," Thomas said. "And by Wednesday morning he has a problem he cannot buy his way out of." He said it without satisfaction, just as information, which Mason found more convincing than if he'd seemed to enjoy it. After Thomas left, Scarlett stood in the parking lot in the cool mountain night and didn't say anything for a while. The motel sign hummed. The lot was empty except for 2 cars and a truck with out-of-state plates. "My father used to say," she said finally, "that the worst thing about dishonest people wasn't the damage they did. It was the way they made you doubt the honest ones." She looked at the sky, which had finally cleared while they were inside, the stars sharp and numerous over the mountains. He'd been let down badly by someone he'd trusted for 40 years. And he still trusted Carl. He still trusted that someone would find what he'd hidden. He trusted the engine, Mason said. She looked at him. He built it into something he knew would last, Mason said. Something he knew someone with the right knowledge would eventually take apart and look at carefully. He thought about Carl's handwriting in the workshop margins. Compartment sealed per GW's request. 2 men who'd understood each other well enough to hide a truth inside a machine. He was right about that. Scarlett was quiet for a moment. "I owe you an apology that's bigger than the one I gave you in the garage," she said. "What I said at the party, you were performing," Mason said. "I know." "I was cruel," she said. "Not just performing. I was using you for an easy laugh because I was nervous about the car and what it might mean, and you were the safest target in the room." She said it plainly, no softening. I don't want that to be the thing you remember most about this." Mason thought about it. "I remember the engine," he said. "I remember what I found in it. That's what I'll remember most." She looked at him for a moment. "That's either very forgiving or very focused," she said. "Probably both," Mason said. "I'm a mechanic. I look at what's in front of me." Inside the room, through this window. Liam had woken up and was sitting on the bed with the remote control, scrolling through channels with the methodical patience of a child who had already checked every option once and was doing it again in case something had changed. Mason watched him through the glass. "He's going to be fine, you know," Scarlett said. She was watching through the window, too. Today was a hard day, and he handled it like he was remarkable. He usually is, Mason said. I don't say that because he's mine. I say it because I watch him and it's true. He gets it from somewhere, Scarlett said. Mason didn't have an answer for that. He went back inside. Liam looked up when the door opened. Did everything happen? He said. Everything happened, Mason said. We're okay. Liam nodded. He put the remote down and lay back on the bed and closed his eyes with the efficiency of a child who had been waiting for exactly that confirmation before allowing himself to sleep. Mason sat in the chair by the window and watched the parking lot and the road beyond it for a long time. And the night was quiet, and the mountains held their shape in the dark around them, and the documents were already in motion. The story didn't break the way stories broke in movies. All at once, in a single dramatic moment, everything illuminated simultaneously. It broke the way old engines fail in reverse, piece by piece, system by system, each component coming apart in sequence, until the thing that had seemed solid revealed itself as having been held together mostly by the assumption that no one would look too closely. Thomas Hargrove made his calls before dawn on Sunday. By Monday morning, 2 federal investigators had copies of Gerald Whitmore's financial records. By Monday afternoon, a forensic accountant retained by Hargrove's firm had spent 6 hours with the documents and produced a preliminary assessment that used the phrase systematic and deliberate misappropriation 4 times in 11 pages. By Tuesday, a journalist at a Nashville investigative outlet who had spent 3 years trying to find a thread into the Whitmore Company's financial irregularities received a package through a source she trusted absolutely and spent 48 hours verifying everything before she made a single call. Richard Holloway learned what was coming on Wednesday morning from the journalist's call requesting comment. He said through his attorney that the allegations were without merit and that he looked forward to addressing them through appropriate legal channels. By Wednesday evening, 3 members of the Whitmore Board of Directors, men who had worked alongside Richard for decades and had, it would turn out, their own reasons to be nervous about what a thorough investigation might uncover, began making phone calls to their own attorneys. Mason knew most of this secondhand, in pieces, through calls from Scarlett that came at odd hours over the following days. He'd gone back to Millhaven on Sunday. Back to the garage, back to Liam's school schedule, back to the specific texture of his ordinary life, which felt both exactly as it always had and subtly different in a way he couldn't fully name. Like a room where someone has moved the furniture back to its original position, but you still know it was moved. He was replacing a water pump on a 2009 F-150 when Scarlett called on Thursday. The forensic physician in Nashville, she said, without preamble. Dr. Reyes. She reviewed the envelope. Mason set the wrench down on the fender. And? My father described symptoms consistent with thallium exposure, Scarlett said. Thallium it's a heavy metal, odorless, tasteless, water-soluble. The symptoms present gradually and can be mistaken for other conditions. A pause. His official autopsy 9 years ago was a standard cardiac workup. Nobody was looking for thallium. Nobody had a reason to look. Can they still find it? Thallium accumulates in bone tissue, Scarlett said. Dr. Reyes has filed a formal request for exhumation with the county. It requires a judge's approval, and normally that process takes months. But given the federal investigation that opened Tuesday, Thomas expects the timeline to accelerate. Another pause, longer this time. He's been in this country for 30 years. He has resources and contacts, and I spent 4 days thinking he might actually find a way to make this disappear. Did he? Mason said. No. The word came out solid. 2 of the Shell account recipients have already agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for consideration on their own exposure. Once people start talking, Richard can't seal it fast enough. She paused again. One of his associates told investigators that Richard had commissioned a private research report on thallium toxicology 14 months before my father died. There's a paper trail. Mason looked at the engine of the F-150, the water pump. Simple system, clear purpose, everything visible once you got the cover off. He's going to be arrested, Scarlett said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, Mason said. Thomas says probably within the next 2 weeks. Federal charges for the financial crimes first, then the investigation into my father's death runs parallel. She stopped. I've been trying to figure out how I feel about that. The arrest part. I thought I'd feel I don't know what I thought. Satisfied, maybe. Do you? Not really. I feel tired. She said it plainly, the way she said things when she wasn't performing anything. I feel like someone's been pressing on a bruise for 9 years, and they finally stopped. And now I have to figure out what the bruise feels like on its own without the pressure. A beat. That's a strange way to put it. No, it's not, Mason said. He heard her exhale on the other end. How's Liam? She said. Back to normal. He told his class he went on a camping trip and had to cross a lake in a leaky boat, which is technically accurate. Did they believe him? His teacher asked me about it at pickup Monday, Mason said. I told her the boat was small but seaworthy. She seemed unconvinced. Scarlett made the sound that was almost a laugh. It was becoming more recognizable to him. A short, real sound that happened when something caught her off guard in the right direction. I'm coming to Millhaven next week, she said. If that's all right, I want to bring the Porsche. Mason paused. You're going to trailer it down? I'm going to have it trailered down, yes. I can't drive it. That's rather the point. A pause. I want you to finish what you started. I want to hear it run. He thought about the engine, about the sabotaged fuel injection and the modified ignition timing and the hidden compartment and Carl's handwriting on a schematic, about everything that Carr had been carrying for 9 years without being able to move. It's going to take time, he said. One of the components will need to be fabricated. I don't have the equipment for that in-house. I know a machinist in Cookville who can do it, but he runs on his own schedule. How long? Couple of months, Mason said. Maybe 3. I won't rush it. I know you won't, she said. It wasn't a compliment. It was just an accurate observation about who he was, which felt better than a compliment. Scarlett, he said. Yes. Carl built something that lasted long enough to matter. Your father trusted it to hold what it needed to hold. Whatever happens with the trial, whatever the investigation finds, that part already worked. A long silence. I know, she said quietly. I know it did. The Porsche arrived on a flatbed the following Wednesday, driven by a transport company that handled vintage vehicles and treated the car with appropriate respect, which Mason noted and approved of. He signed the paperwork in the garage doorway while the driver walked him through the condition documentation, pointing out the original damage and the storage specifications and the fact that the temperature control had been maintained during transport. When the car was off the flatbed and sitting in Mason's garage, the driver left and Mason stood in front of it alone for a minute. It looked different here than it had in Scarlett's climate-controlled showpiece garage. Here it sat under fluorescent shop lights on concrete that was permanently stained with the accumulated work of years, surrounded by ordinary tools and ordinary vehicles in ordinary states of repair. Here it looked like what it was, a real car, a working thing, something built by human hands to move through the actual world rather than sit still and be preserved. Carl would have approved of that, Mason thought. He started the disassembly carefully, photographing everything as he went, making notes in the composition book he used for complex jobs. He worked the fuel injection system first, documenting the modifications before he began reversing them, because Thomas Hargrove had asked him to document the sabotage thoroughly as potential evidence for the criminal case. So Mason photographed every modified component from multiple angles and wrote up a technical description that he then had to rewrite 3 times because the first version was too specific for anyone without mechanical knowledge to follow. And the point was for a jury to eventually understand it, not just another mechanic. He sent the documentation to Thomas on a Friday afternoon and got a response within an hour. This is exactly what we needed. Thank you. Plain words. Mason saved the message without quite knowing why. The work on the Porsche became a rhythm over the following weeks, something he returned to between other jobs. The way you might return to a book you were reading slowly and carefully because you didn't want to get to the end. He sourced the parts he could through the specialty suppliers Carl had used, some of which still existed, and some of which had become other things, requiring him to find alternative sources for components that had been discontinued for 2 decades. The fuel injection parts came from a restorer in Colorado who had a warehouse of old stock and a phone manor that was pure old Tennessee, even though he'd never set foot east of New Mexico. The fabricated component, a specific bracket in the ignition timing system that had been modified beyond repair and no longer existed as a purchasable part, required 3 conversations with the machinist in Cookville and 2 weeks of waiting before it arrived in a cardboard box packed in foam, machined to the exact specification Mason had provided, which itself had come from a combination of Carl's original schematic and Mason's own measurements of the surviving hardware. When he held the finished component in his hand, he thought about Carl at his workbench, explaining something with his hands in the air. Every component tells you something. Don't assume you already know what it's saying. He pressed it to fit with exactly the resistance it should have. Clean, solid, correct. Richard Holloway was arrested on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after the documents had left the Mountain Motel room in Thomas Hargrove's briefcase. The arrest was federal, which meant it happened at his home at 6 in the morning with minimal drama by design, and the news reported it with the careful neutrality of major financial crime coverage. Facts, charges, no adjectives the network's lawyers hadn't approved. Fraud, conspiracy, and, pending the forensic investigation, which was still in process, a charge that the news coverage referred to as suspected homicide by poisoning, which was the kind of phrase that sat differently on the screen than the financial charges, more solid somehow, more final. Mason was in the garage when Scarlett called. He wiped his hands on a rag and sat on the stool he kept near the workbench. "It happened," she said. "I saw," he said. "I didn't watch the news coverage," she said. "I turned it off after the first segment. I don't want to watch people who didn't know my father discuss what happened to him in 2-minute increments." "That's reasonable," Mason said. "Thomas says the forensic case is strong. The exhumation, they found thallium in my father's bone tissue, levels consistent with repeated exposure over a period of weeks." Her voice was steady. He'd learned by now that steady was how she sounded when she was feeling the most, not the least. "I was being poisoned gradually." His body was shutting down while everyone around him, including his doctors, were looking for a cardiac explanation. Mason held the phone and looked at the Porsche across the garage. He knew something was wrong, Mason said. That's why he was moving so fast to document everything. He was racing against something he could feel but couldn't name. "Yes," Scarlett said. "Thomas thinks that's exactly right. He had maybe 6 to 8 weeks between when the symptoms started and when he died. He spent them building the best case he could and hiding it in the safest places he knew." A pause. "And he ran out of time." "He didn't run out of time," Mason said. "He just ran out of time in his lifetime. The case is still there. It held." Another pause. Longer. "You sound like him sometimes," she said. "My father. The way you say things." She stopped herself. "I don't mean that as a comparison. I mean it as... I don't know what I mean it as. Forget it." "I won't forget it," Mason said. "I'll take it." She was quiet for a moment. "How's the car?" she said. "Getting close," he said. "Another week, maybe 10 days. The fabricated component fits. I'm going back through the ignition system this week. Then it's the fuel injection verification and a full systems check before I even think about starting it." "And you think it'll run?" "Carl built it," Mason said. "It'll run." He heard something in her breathing change slightly. "I'm going to drive down when you're ready," she said. "I want to be there." "I know," he said. "I'll call you." The last 10 days of the work were the kind of work Mason liked best. The detailed, close work that required complete attention and rewarded it, where every small right thing built on the previous small right thing until the whole picture came into focus. He went through the fuel injection system component by component, verifying his repairs, checking the connections, testing the pressure where he could test it before the engine ran. He went through the ignition timing with the new bracket in place and felt the whole system come together with the particular satisfaction of a puzzle whose final piece turns out to be the right shape. He replaced the fluids, fresh oil, coolant, brake fluid, and sat back and looked at what he'd built back from what someone had deliberately broken, and felt something that was close to the feeling Carl had tried to teach him about. The feeling that meant you'd done the work right. He called Scarlett on a Thursday evening. "Saturday morning," he said. "Come Saturday morning." She arrived at 9. She drove herself alone in the dark SUV and parked it in the garage lot and came through the side door the way people came in when they knew the place well enough to use the real entrance rather than the public one. She was in jeans and a plain gray sweater, and her hair was down, and she was carrying 2 coffees, one of which she handed to Mason without preamble. Liam was there. It was a Saturday, and Liam spent Saturdays at the garage, a habit that had started when he was 6 and showed no signs of changing. He was at the workbench doing something with a carburetor Mason had given him to take apart, purely as an exercise, because the boy had been asking questions about how things worked for long enough that Mason had decided the best answer was direct experience. When Scarlett came in, Liam looked up, said hey, and looked back at the carburetor. Scarlett looked at Mason. Hey, Mason said, in the tone that meant he likes you. That's just how he shows it. She seemed to understand this without translation. The Porsche was in the center of the garage under the main shop lights. Fully assembled now, every component in its place, the engine covers back on. It looked exactly like what it had been built to look like. A piece of serious, committed craftsmanship that had been designed to look effortless precisely because of how much effort had gone into it. Lunar mist paint under the fluorescence, silver that sat between colors, the way Carl had said. Scarlett stood in front of it for a moment. Same as the day my father took delivery, she said. He sent me a photograph. I was 12. I remember thinking it was the most serious-looking car I'd ever seen. She walked around it slowly, the way Mason had taught her without meaning to, the full perimeter before you touch anything. He said Carl had given it a soul. I thought that was ridiculous. I was 12. What do you think now? Mason said. She completed the circuit and came back to where she'd started. I think some things are built with enough intention that they accumulate something, she said. Not a soul. I don't know what word to use, just weight, meaning, the record of what they were made for. She looked at Mason. Carl gave it that. My father used it for that. You brought it back. Mason didn't have a response that wasn't embarrassing, so he picked up the key from the workbench and held it out to her. She looked at it. You should start it, she said. It's your car, he said. It was my father's car, she said, and Carl built it, and you fixed it. She kept her hands at her sides. You've earned the right to start it more than I have. He held the key for a moment. Then he opened the driver's door. The sound of the latch, precise and solid, the way Carl's latches always were, and got in. The seat fit like a seat was supposed to fit. The wheel was where it was supposed to be. He looked at the gauges, the instrument cluster Carl had built to tell a driver exactly what they needed to know and nothing superfluous. He put the key in the ignition, looked up through the windshield at Scarlett standing in front of the car, looked in the rear view at Liam, who had put the carburetor down and come to stand at the back of the garage, arms at his sides, watching. Mason turned the key. The engine caught on the first rotation. Not a struggle, not a grinding reluctance, just the immediate authoritative response of a machine that had been built correctly and repaired correctly and was doing what it had always been meant to do. The flat six settled into an idle that was smooth and steady and carried a particular sound, low and purposeful, that Mason had heard described by people who didn't know how to describe engines as a voice. He understood what they meant by it now in a way he hadn't fully understood before. The Porsche sounded like it was saying something. He sat in the driver's seat and let it idle and didn't say anything, and the engine ran. Scarlett stood in front of it with her hand over her mouth. Not performing, just what happened when something you had believed might never occur finally occurred, and your body needed a moment to process the gap between the possibility you'd held and the reality that had arrived. Liam, from the back of the garage, said, "It sounds good, Dad." It did sound good. It sounded exactly right. Mason let it run for another 2 minutes, monitoring the gauges, watching for anything that needed attention. Nothing did. The temperature came up to operating range and held there. The oil pressure was correct. Every system was doing what it was supposed to do. He turned the engine off. The garage went quiet. Scarlett took her hand away from her mouth. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying, not quite, the way some people can be at the edge of something without going over it because they've practiced holding that particular edge for a long time. He would have loved that, she said. Not to Mason specifically, just out loud, to whatever was in the room that could receive it. Mason got out of the car and stood beside her. He thought about what she'd said. He would have loved that. And about the particular tragedy and the particular grace of building something that outlasted you, of putting enough of yourself and your intention into a made thing that it carried forward what you couldn't carry yourself. Carl had understood that. Gerald Whitmore had understood it in a different way, building his evidence into the same machine, trusting the craftsmanship to protect the truth long enough for someone to find it. Both of them were gone. The thing they'd made together was here, running. There was something to be said about that. Mason wasn't a man who said things like that out loud, usually. but he thought it clearly enough that it felt like saying it. "What happens now?" Liam said, appearing at his elbow in the way he did. He was looking at the Porsche with the straightforward curiosity of a kid who had processed the emotional moment and moved on to practical questions. "With the car." "Your dad keeps it here," Scarlett said. "In the garage, until I figure out where it belongs." Liam looked at Mason. "Can I sit in it?" he said. Mason looked at Scarlett. "Of course," she said. Liam opened the driver's door with appropriate care and climbed in and put his hands on the wheel and looked through the windshield at the garage wall with the expression of a 9-year-old who was somewhere between the age he was and some imagined future age, trying on the fit of it. Scarlett watched him. "He's going to be trouble when he's 16, she said quietly. "He's already trouble," Mason said. "He's just polite about it." She smiled. A real one, not the practiced version from the party, not the careful version she used when she was being precise about something. The one that happened when she wasn't thinking about it. They stood beside the Porsche while Liam sat in it and made small adjustments to the mirror with the seriousness of someone preparing for an actual journey. Over the following months, Richard Holloway's trial became the kind of news story that ran in segments over a long period. Not the explosive single-week coverage of a simpler story, but the accumulating, layered coverage of a case with many threads and many people pulling them. Associates cooperated. Documents surfaced. The forensic case around Gerald Whitmore's death became, as Thomas Hargrove had predicted, an avalanche that a man with resources and lawyers could slow but not stop. Mason followed it in pieces, the way he followed most things that happened outside the garage. Enough to know the shape of it, not so much that it consumed the ordinary life he was living in the meantime. He read that a former official had confirmed accepting payments from Holloway over 11 years. He read that the forensic evidence from the exhumation had been admitted. He read that Holloway had changed his plea posture twice, which Thomas explained in a call to Scarlett that Mason was part of as the strategy of a man who was trying to find a version of events he could survive. He didn't find one. The sentencing happened on a Tuesday in March, 11 months after Mason had first driven to the Whitmore estate in his 12-year-old pickup to look at a car that couldn't run. Life imprisonment on the conspiracy and murder charges. A parallel federal sentence on the fraud charges that would be served concurrently, and that included the forfeiture of assets accumulated through the fraudulent transfers, assets that, once the legal process was complete, would be largely returned to the Whitmore estate and therefore to the company and the employees and the people downstream of it who hadn't known any of this was happening. Scarlett called Mason from outside the courthouse. He could hear traffic behind her, the sounds of a city in the middle of an afternoon. "It's done," she said. "I know. I saw." "I didn't feel what I expected to feel," she said. "Again. I keep expecting to feel something clean, and instead I feel complicated." "What did you expect to feel?" "I don't know. Finished." She paused. "I think maybe finished isn't a feeling. I think finished is just a state, and the feelings you have inside it are the same complicated ones you always had." Mason thought about that. "Yeah," he said. "That sounds right." A pause. "The board voted yesterday," she said, "to rename the company's main research building after my father. It's not justice, exactly. It's just a building with his name on it. But he built that company from 40 people. He deserved to have his name on something that lasted." "He built other things that lasted," Mason said. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "He did." Mason was in the garage, the way he usually was when she called. The Porsche was against the far wall under a cover that was better quality than the one it had arrived under. Mason had ordered it specifically, the right fit for the body lines, the right material for the climate. He looked at it while he listened to the traffic sounds behind her voice. "I want to drive it," she said. "When I come down, I want to actually drive it." "Where?" he said. "I don't know. Somewhere with an empty road." A pause. "My father always said the point of a car like that wasn't what it looked like sitting still. The point was what it felt like to move." "He was right about that," Mason said. "Will you come? Show me the roads." He looked at the garage, at the F-150 that needed its water pump checked again, at the inventory he'd been putting off, at the scheduling board with 3 jobs backed up for next week. "Yeah," he said. "I'll come." Liam, at the workbench behind him, had moved on from carburetors to a distributor cap Mason had given him as an upgrade in complexity. He was holding it up to the light the way Mason had once watched Carl hold a component up to the light, turning it slowly, looking at it from different angles, trying to understand something by looking at all of it rather than just the obvious part. Mason watched his son do that and felt something that didn't have a clean name. Not pride exactly, though pride was in it. Something bigger than pride, less defined, the feeling of watching a person become themselves in real time. He thought about what Scarlett had said at the motel, "You're a good father," and about how the strange thing about being a good parent was that it had very little to do with doing everything right and almost everything to do with just not leaving. Showing up, staying in, letting the kid watch you make decisions and live with them and try again. He thought about Carl, who had taught him that same principle through engines. About Gerald Whitmore, who had embodied it through the way he'd prepared his daughter's inheritance. Not money, not a company, but a truth that could hold. The things that lasted weren't always the things people planned to make last. Sometimes they were made without anyone fully knowing that's what they were making. Sometimes you built something and didn't know until years later what it was really for. On a Friday in April, Scarlett drove down from the estate in the Porsche herself, running perfectly Gerald Whitmore's car back on the road after a decade of silence, and pulled into Mason's garage with the expression of someone who had just done something they'd been waiting a long time to do. Liam looked up from the workbench. "You drove it," he said. "I drove it," she said. "How was it?" She looked at the car, at the lunar mist paint in the afternoon light coming through the garage door, that particular silver that sat between colors. "Like it was always supposed to happen," she said. Liam nodded, satisfied, and went back to what he was doing. Mason stood in the doorway with his coffee going cold in his hand, looking at Scarlett and the car and his son at the workbench, and the afternoon light coming through the garage, and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of people who had come through something hard and were still standing, a little changed, not perfectly, but standing. That was enough. That was, in his experience, usually how it went. Not a clean conclusion, but a moment where you looked around at what remained and understood that remaining was itself the point, and that some things, if built right, stayed built through everything that tried to take them apart. The Porsche sat in his garage and didn't make a sound.